Very good. Hello. Hi, thanks everyone for attending our session today from GfK on Generation 1.5. And I think most people, does this have to be pointed somewhere in particular? Yeah, it's not advancing. I think most people are familiar with the term a generation. A lot of our clients are asking us about millennials, asking about Gen Z, really trying to understand different cohorts. But what I want to introduce today is the concept of Generation 1.5. I don't know, how many people are familiar with that term 1.5, the 1.5 generation? No? A couple. So Generation 1.5 is a term that is used to really describe people who have come to the United States not as adults, not as infants, but really as an adolescent. So they feel kind of in between two worlds. They have enough of a memory as a child of their home country, so they retain some of that culture, but have also come to the United States, or the country that they've gone to, still during their formative years. So they feel this push and pull between two cultures. So you see that Generation 1.5 term is used to describe an immigrant who had come to the country when they're an adolescent. But I think, or we think, that this term, the 1.5 generation, is very relevant for where the consumer is today collectively. Because if you think about, a few years ago, everyone was talking about the term digital native, and we're using that term to describe millennials. And flash forward to today, the digital native of today, when you think about a child today who's grown up with a touchscreen interface, that's really the digital native. It's not someone who has always used a computer. So we're continually kind of evolving our definition. And I think the term 1.5 is very appropriate for where we are as a culture, because we're very much in between. Many people feel this in-between state. We're about a half a generation removed from the beginning of the smartphone, mass adoption of the smartphone. We're about a half a generation removed from the global economic crisis of 2008. And we're very much in between generations in terms of marketing, with big cohorts going through different life stage transitions. So this concept of being one foot in each world, I think, is very relevant when we're looking at consumers and where they are today, and what does that mean for marketing to consumers in the future. So what I want to do is think about this concept of 1.5, and if we were able to talk to a representative of the 1.5 generation today, what would they tell us as marketers? And there's three areas I'm going to use my 15 minutes to share with you. The first is that this is a consumer that feels they are very much ahead of where the marketing community is and where the larger business community is. We also see that this is a generation that is going to continue to challenge marketers. And thirdly, this is a generation that is seeking reassurance. So to first probe onto this idea, I'm ahead of you. One of the things that we look at in our study, and I'm referencing a study that GfK does in 35 markets around the world annually, and we've been conducting this study since the late 1990s. So we have a very long-term perspective of not only where consumers have been globally, but what do those trends mean for understanding the consumer of tomorrow and where they're going. And one of the things we do to understand this is look at people's core values, or what we determine as guiding principles in their lives. And we can see how those values are, which values are becoming more important, which values are becoming less important, where is the momentum, which pockets of, which subsegments of people are gravitating towards certain values. And these four values are four of the values that we have seen the biggest momentum behind, I would say, since 2008. So since the global economic crisis, this is where the positive momentum has been. So a value like freedom, being able to express yourself, not having to feel constrained by societal expectations. To be free and self-reliant is one value that is on the rise. the value of learning and the way we define learning as being kind of a lifelong process and engagement is also something that is on the rise. And I think that's very interesting when you marry how technology affords us the ability to investigate and kind of feed our curiosity. We see that learning has been on the rise, as has creativity, I think closely linked to that concept of learning, being creative and wanting to experiment more, and adventure. So all of these things, I think, speak to a more kind of open-minded, more experiential consumer. We have a few examples on this slide of different programs that I think speak to some of these ideas of creativity and adventure. The one I'll focus on, these are from all over the world, from Shanghai to Zimbabwe to Sweden. On the left is Goldilocks, which is in the United States, but really fostering creativity and adventure among it's a child manufacturer of toys, but really I think taps into this notion of creativity and adventure. I'm going to share with you through this presentation a couple of current advertisements that you may or may not have seen. They're all based outside the United States, but I'm sharing those with you because these are marketers that I think have really taken this notion of creativity and adventure and freedom and are executing very well on it in terms of marketing to consumers. And the first one that I want to share with you comes out of Ogilvy in the UK. And this is for British Airways, so if we can cue that up. Whoops. Can we go back and play that?
Public saw as magic was actually a carefully orchestrated feat of technology. We mounted an ADS-B antenna on the roof of a nearby building to read live data directly from each aircraft's transponder within 200 kilometers. All aircraft emit radio waves containing their speed, altitude, GPS location, and a call sign. Our antenna was connected to a PC with a custom-built application, which identified the British Airways planes and sent the data to our cloud server that controlled the billboards. We created a virtual trigger zone in the sky that acted like a tripwire, so that when a BA plane entered our trigger zone, within 0.2 seconds we'd cross-reference the registration number with flight data from Heathrow to determine the destination. Cloud altitude data told us if the plane could be seen, and if it could, the information was sent to our billboard, interrupting the current content and playing our ad. Targeted a moment. The moment a plane flies overhead, inspiring our audience to share what they saw and igniting their passion to explore the world.
On the values that I mentioned that are rising, those of creativity, curiosity, adventure, learning. I think this is a great example of tapping into some of those emerging consumer values in a very, kind of fun and interactive way. If you think of a child, seeing an airplane go across the sky and wondering where that is, that childlike kind of curiosity. This campaign did an excellent job of capturing that and articulating it and linking it back to the British Airways brand. We also see that when we ask consumers in our study about innovation and what does innovation mean to them, and we look at the next generation, so again, that 1.5 generation, and here I'm defining it as teenagers around the world, so those 15 to 19 years old today, what we see is that their definition of innovation is really about being unique and being fun. So certainly I'm going to talk about how innovation is about convenience and timeliness and making things simple, and I don't mean to say that those aren't relevant at all. But when we look at the younger generation, in some ways those are really kind of table stakes now, and that's the expectation. Where we're going beyond is in this desire for innovation and introducing excitement and fun into the innovation process. So what I want to share with you next is my second advertisement, which is another one from Coca-Cola. So we're here in Coca-Cola's headquarters. And I think this ad, again, speaks to how you can innovate with that idea of fun and uniqueness behind it. And this comes from Coca-Cola in Colombia, so in Latin America. If we can play that. Innovation in the packaging, and I think that's a great example that speaks to kind of uniqueness and fun, and again ties back to the brand's DNA and the brand's essence and their promise to consumers. So in some ways we see this 1.5 generation consumer is ahead of us. We also see a lot of evidence of where they will challenge us as marketers. So I'd like to now move into where we will challenge you. One of the things that we are starting to see in our studies, and have really just picked up on this, I would say in the last 6 to 12 months, and it's kind of a nascent trend, but we're starting to track it, is an increasing kind of pushback on technology and the sense of technology kind of moving from the foreground to the background. So that it's not technology for tech's sake, not being the primary role, but it's what does technology do for me, and moving that away into the foreground. So we see that the value of simplicity, I mentioned a few values already of freedom and creativity and learning. Another value that we track is that of simplicity, and that is one that has increased 4 ranks across the globe since 2010. So it has been definitely on the rise in a lot of different markets around the world. We also see that more and more consumers globally agree with a statement that I'm looking for ways in which to simplify my life. And our tolerance for the complex is we're having a shorter and shorter kind of tolerance for that. More and more consumers say they lose interest in a product if it is not simple and easy to use. So if you think about user experience and design, that simplicity, that notion of being intuitive is becoming more and more important to consumers. And we see this even among the youngest consumers. So when we go back and we look at teens, you see that these true digital natives also have a lower and lower tolerance for complexity and will increasingly lose interest if something is too complex. So we do see that ease and simplicity is definitely a mandate coming from consumers. So when we look at the different markets in our study, we see that more and more consumers say that simplicity and ease is something that they're looking for. One outlier here is South Korea. We see that, and in many ways, South Korea, I think, we see it as a leading edge market in terms of some global trends. And this is a market that is leading in terms of uniqueness as well. So, but definitely globally, ease and simplicity is an increasing mandate from consumers. And the last area I just want to touch on in my remaining couple of minutes is the need for reassurance or the desire for security on the part of consumers. And surely, if you just pick up today's news headlines, you do see that there are tremendous insecurities, volatility, instability in the world. Almost 6 out of 10 consumers globally say they are always concerned about their personal security and safety. This is highest in Latin America, followed by North America, but is something that trends, we see it really all across the globe. And what is interesting is if we tie this back to the first area of exploration that we talked about, this idea of a more open-minded, more experiential consumer, what we see is that consumer, more interested in experiences, but at the same time are the intangibles. But we also see that when you're more in tune with intangibles, those are the things that might be driving your sense of a lack of security. So for example, when we ask consumers where are they most satisfied with various elements of their lives, for example, a few line items here, the car you drive, your home electronics, your home appliances, all of these things are very tangible and people feel generally satisfied with them. However, when we go down a little bit further down the list and get to some of the intangibles, where we are placing more intrinsic value today, we also see we are less satisfied with those elements of our lives. So a real interesting dynamic in terms of our aspirations and what we want to experience, yet at the same time, our satisfaction and our expectations in those areas, they're less satisfying. So we're seeing that this fuels into some of that sense of insecurity. And one example here, MeWe is a social media platform that, if you're not familiar with it, it's basing, its USP is all around privacy and security. So recognizing the social connection is an inherently human one, but how can they fall into that niche where people are really concerned about privacy and security? So I think an interesting example to end with in terms of marketers who are kind of thinking about this drive for security and safety. So with that, I wanted to share with you a very brief perspective on Generation 1.5, the fact that they are already ahead of us, that they will challenge us, and they continue to need reassurance. And with that, I think we have 1 minute for questions or comments.
Okay, if we have one burning question, because we are running late, I see. Okay, microphone coming to you.
Thank you very much. What an interesting presentation. Can you say something about the values that are decreasing?
Yes, which I didn't talk about at all. But some of the values that we see decreasing are what fall, when we do a scan or a map, they fall into what we call the traditional quadrant. So things like obedience, respecting ancestors, traditional gender roles, these would be some of the values that would be on the decrease globally. That's not to say there are definitely some markets where those values remain very, very relevant and important, but when you look at it at a global aggregate, those would be some of the values that are on the decrease. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you.